Yeah, that does trip people out, I think, because it starts at a minute and counts down. Maybe we need to switch that up, because you glanced up at one point and it said like 47 seconds, and you're like, oh shit.
I saw like 52, and I'm like, oh, I'm right on cue here. But I'm like, no, this is just the beginning.
And you were only 8 seconds in.
I know. My life is sad.
Burning through this.
Nice. Well, that was the short version. We're going to go through the deep dive here. So why don't we talk? We often talk about how you got started and things, but I want to talk just how we first met originally. So we first met in London, Ontario. It was I started doing stand-up in London in 2009, and early 2010 started working on a late-night talk show called London Tonight with Jeff Leeson, with a mutual friend of ours, Jeff Leeson, who's an amazing stand-up comedian. And you had just won, I believe you had just won the Yuck Yucks Great Canadian Laugh Off, and then you were a guest. You were a guest on the show, which was like a late night cable TV talk show, and you were the stand-up guest. And then you had a segment on the show, and then I think about a year later, you came back at Big League Comedy.
Change the light bulb.
Right, yeah. And I remember that. I remember two things about you. I just started, so I had maybe like from October 2009 to the end of that year, I was maybe on a stand-up stage once a week, or maybe once every couple weeks. So I probably had less than 10 stand-up appearances under my belt when I first met you. When I met you, you had just won this giant oversized check, but you were still fairly new too. It wasn't like you were a veteran. You were still very much an up and comer.
I think I was like 3 years in at that time.
Right. So I saw you. I was like, holy shit, this guy just won 25 grand for doing stand-up. Yeah. So I immediately I took notice of you. And one of the things we'll talk about throughout this episode is one of the things I really noticed is you were producing and hosting your own shows, sometimes stand-up shows, sometimes sort of weird concept, hybrid type shows. And I think that's a huge lesson for people. So do you want to just speak to that? Like, how did that come about? Because you'd only been doing stand-up for a little while, but all of a sudden now you're instantly producing and hosting shows, which is a big leap for some people.
Okay. So I can tell you, like, when I started stand-up, I knew absolutely nothing about stand-up. But I, from the Toronto area, from Scarborough, and I knew people who owned bars and people who ran bars and people at York University who were apparently like pretty powerful, and I had no idea who they were. Like, I just used to serve them because I used to work at York. And so the comics will remain nameless, but I remember being at a show that these two comics walked in and bumped everybody, and it was like a garbage bucket show at like 3 p.m. They bumped everybody. They went on stage and both talked about how they had nothing to talk about, how they don't know why they're there, and that they're going to just go and do another show. And I was just so pissed because I didn't come from this type of world where this happened, like just kind of understanding like the show business aspect. So I was just like, you know what, like, forget about this. I'm just going to go start my own show and not allow anybody to bump anybody. Like, that's it. Like, you send me a message, you can get on. But if you just show up and expect to get on, it's not going to happen. So I knew some people who own bars, and then I worked at a place at York. So then when I was at like my big peak of running shows, I was doing a Monday weekly show, a Thursday bi-weekly, and a Friday weekly show. And that was kind of my routine for the first while.
Nice. Let's take it back even further. What was the first time you ever performed? It's like whether it's stand-up, or was there anything earlier in your life as a child? Like, did you do talent shows or anything?
No, I worked at a burger place with a microphone. That was the only microphone experience I had. I have never in my life thought that it would happen. I went to Humber, actually. So what happened was I finished high school and had absolutely no direction. And it's not to say that I have direction now, but I had a path. And I finished school and I Googled, we'll rewind a bit. I got into filming skate videos. I liked doing that, okay? So I'm like, let me go for editing. I wanted to go for school for editing. So I went to school at Seneca for editing, and I dropped out. Wasn't really going well, and I was like, editing is kind of like writing. Like I don't even know how I put this all together in my head. And I'm like, let me see if there's a writing program in Toronto, but with no Shakespeare. I don't want to deal with anything Shakespeare based. So I Googled writing program with no Shakespeare, and Humber College popped up. And I'm like, what is this? And it was comedy writing and performing. And I ended up applying for that the same time I applied for Seneca when I went for digital media arts for film and editing. But they called me and they said they had to come in and audition and showcase. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, you need to come in, do stand-up, sketch, write this. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do that. I just want to go for writing. They're like, well, you can't come then. So I didn't go. I dropped out of Seneca. I reapplied. And then I ended up having to go and actually audition. And that was really the first time I've ever performed. And then in Humber is when I performed at Yucks for the first time.
Wow. So take note, listeners and viewers, his career in stand-up and comedy and showbiz started with rejection from Humber because he didn't do what they wanted to do. Rejection / defiance, and then by dropping out from another program. So it was like
it came back around, yeah.
Failure, and then came back around a year later to some success.
And at that time I was like 21 when I dropped out of Seneca, and I was like working at a restaurant and doing like some light construction on the weekend. And I'm just like, what am I doing with my life? And then I figured that I'd rather try and stand in front of 3 weirdos in my mind and do stand-up than, live that type of life.
Then dig a ditch. Yeah,
exactly.
Choice. You mentioned your only microphone experience was at a burger joint with a microphone. Was that like the order microphone where you're
when you call up people's names.
So were you like?
Did you ever have like a catchphrase while you were doing that?
No.
No sense of crowd work. You weren't like
not at all.
Throwing some zingers out there.
So this is the thing. This is what bothers me about stand-up is like the only thing I ever had to offer before was people would consider me like a funny guy. And then once you become a comedian, you lose that quality because now they're like, oh, you're just trying to be a comic or something, right? So it was like at this place, it was an independently owned place. The owner was really cool. We were cool with him. So there was a lot of banter. And the reason why we were so busy is because it was like 5 or 6 of us worked there. And yeah, like if you came at us, we would definitely come back at you. But also it was all joking around, and like it was a lot of returning guests. So you knew people. So you would be able to like now riff with them, like, make fun of them or whatever. And that's what would happen. But we all kind of did it, and then there would be a lot of like, just like shit talking or telling stories in the back. But with customers, it was a lot of like back and forth riffing, especially drunk people, because it was all pub nights was like Thursday. So like people were getting like drunk and like trying to like, some people try to give you attitude and you would have to riff with them,
So where do you remember your first set ever? Was that at
Yucks?
It was at Yucks, at one of the Tuesday nights.
I didn't even know that comedy open mics existed. So what happened was, so when I was at Humber, I did Yucks, and my cousin had a friend who worked at the supermarket in Kensington. And we were in Kensington, and I'm like, I think I'm trying to do the stand-up thing or whatever. And he's like, my friend runs a show at the supermarket. Let's go there. And I'm like, what? Like, what are we talking about? I'm not ready for this. And he's like, no, whatever. So we go, and the guy was like, no, I'm not putting on comedians. We don't do comedians on this show. And my cousin's like, look, it's my cousin. Just put him on. Finally, he was like, okay, 2 minutes, get off type of thing. So I'm like, whatever. I go up. And there was, I don't know how many people. It was bad. I was doing so bad. And the guy whispers into the microphone and it comes through the monitors. And he's like, get off the stage. And I'm like talking. And then he's like, I'm like, do you guys hear that? And they're like, yeah, get off. And then I had to get off. And then the guy was like, look, man, just go to like a comedy open mic. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, a show with just comedy. I'm like, why the hell does that exist? And then he's like, I don't know, but go there. You're not doing stand-up here. And then so that was like kind of how I started finding out about comedy open mics. And then I booked Einstein's, which was my first 3-month down the road booking. And long story short, this is a big moment actually, because when I was walking there, someone dropped a key in front of me, a house key. And I tried telling the person, and they didn't listen to me. They thought I was like going to attack them or something. So they kept going. So I was like, whatever. And then I go to this show, and it was like a disaster. There was like 4 people there. It was like a weird setup. I'm so nervous.
That's a classic show at Einstein's.
Classic Einstein's show. Yeah. And they call me up, and it's my time to go up. I walk on stage. This is my big moment, my first booking. I had a little card that said like November 20th or whatever. I take the microphone out of the mic stand, and the whole thing falls apart. The mic stand legitimately falls into like 5 pieces, and it's just dead silence. And all you hear is the pole rolling down the whole bar. And I was just like, well, this was the worst thing ever. I waited 3 months for this. And then my material wasn't doing well. But then I started talking about that key, the person dropping that key. And then that started getting laughs. And I think, and I didn't know why, but I'm like, this is kind of like, I guess, in the moment or fresh or something. And I started learning a bit about like talking about environment instead of just material, because it definitely did better than my material.